George F. Johnson, 1857 to 1948, the founder of the Endicott Johnson Shoe Corporation, was an innovative capitalist and factory owner who redefined the responsibilities of employers to their workers. The Massachusetts-born Johnson and his siblings, C. Fred, Harry L., Oscar, and Charlotte, were the driving forces behind the development of schools, recreation areas, parks in the company towns they founded. In 1881, George F., as he was affectionately known, became a foreman at a Binghamton, New York shoe factory. By 1890, he moved to a new factory outside of Binghamton in the small burg of Leicestershire, New York. 9 years later, he joined with Henry B. Endicott to buy out the failing Leicester Shoe Company and formed Endicott Johnson Shoe Corporation. As president, Johnson expanded his business to 8 factories, employing thousands of locals and newly arrived immigrants from Eastern Europe and Italy. Endicott Johnson was a unique example of what became known as welfare capitalism. Welfare capitalism was a reaction to the labor violence, sharp inequality of wealth, and moral critiques of laissez-faire enterprise during the 19th century. The concept grew out of the social alienation experienced by factory workers who left the traditional support of agrarian and family-owned economic systems during the Industrial Revolution. Labor and capitalists both shared a common goal in a labor-intensive business of increased production. The means of reducing unnecessary friction between labor and management included providing improved living and working conditions, gauging wages based on productive output rather than hours, and an increased concern by employers for the workers under them. The results would include company-provided housing, health services, and profit sharing. Endicott Johnson built a system of factories around Binghamton, and with those factories came growing company towns, including Endicott and formerly Leicestershire, which was rechristened Johnson City in 1916. The company-built houses were built in those towns, and the employees could pay their mortgages out of their pay packet. Around the Endicott Johnson factories in Johnson City and Binghamton grew neighborhoods of Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Russians, and Ukrainians, each group constructing and supporting their own ethnic Catholic churches, while Endicott became home to Italian immigrant factory workers. In turn, their extended families created businesses, bakeries, restaurants that exist to this day. On November 1st, 1918, Endicott Johnson became the first shoe company to introduce the 8-hour, 40-hour work week, a work week based on the number of units produced. Johnson saw the monotony of factory work at a fixed wage as a hindrance to productivity. The worker could come in and work as many hours as it took to meet the production goals and receive substantial bonuses at year's end. The company had a windfall from the production of army boots for the U.S. government during the Great War. For Christmas, his workers received a free pair of shoes for each member of the family. The company also built swimming pools, parks, carousels for the enjoyment of working families. The company emphasized not only the responsibility of employers to workers, but the responsibility of the workers to their employers. Negotiations were common between management and shop floor workers, with an emphasis on reaching consensus within a framework of common respect. Despite the cost, the company remained profitable. Nevertheless, trade union organizers supposedly dedicated to the betterment of the working class failed several times to unionize the shop floor. The New York Times took notice of George F. Johnson's success in gaining the loyalty of employees by the failure of unions to organize his shoe workers in 1919. Ever the voice of capital, the Times described, quote, 20,000 men and women working contentedly at fair wages and considering themselves and their bosses as all one big family, end quote. Gerald Zafavi, 1983, wrote of the enmity Johnson produced among union organizers, with one calling him a real Mussolini, who exercises an absolute control over the earnings and lives of several thousand employees and their families. The Boot and Shoe Workers Union failed repeatedly in its quest to unionize Johnson's workers. At the height of its productivity, Endicott Johnson employed 24,000 workers, including my great-grandfather and my grandfather. In the towns, the Johnson name was omnipresent. I attended Harry L. Johnson Elementary School and Seafred Junior High School, as did my father, before attending Johnson City High School. Across from the Johnson Mansion was Sarah Jane Johnson Methodist Church, named after George F.'s beloved mother. The role of the Johnson's Methodist faith in the development of this particular brand of capitalism has yet to be explored, and probably should be. George F. Johnson ingeniously supplied his own public relations through a company magazine, called his version of welfare capitalism the Square Deal, and even installed arches at the entrances of both Endicott and Johnson City, bearing the words, "The home of the Square Deal." The challenges faced by any historian of that time, of course, is that company propaganda might be the only source material available, yet as in all human endeavors, happiness was relative. A plethora of taverns surrounded the company-built houses. I passed 7 myself on the mile-long walk to elementary school, and alcoholism was common. Gerald Zavhavi, 1983, relies on the collection of E.J. Company magazines housed at Syracuse University, and it gives a rather skewed impression of the lives of the working class under Johnson's beneficence. The reality, as always, is more complicated. But after the boom years of World War II, in which Endicott Johnson provided military footwear to the Allies, the business began to fall off after his death in 1948 at the age of 91. By 1957, the Johnson brothers were dead, and the business began to wither. By 1961, there was a management shakeup that attempted to bring the company out of, quote, dire trouble, according to the new CEO. Reporting in an open letter, the new manager, P.J. Casella, noted in plain language the company had no money to operate its business, and he noted 1960 was the first year that the company suffered its first visible loss in history. From 1947 on, the company was shrinking, and rising taxes and costs made it impossible for the company to remain profitable and still offer the benefits of welfare capitalism. The company would have been out of business by 1963 if it had not taken steps to reduce costs and services. In 1963, Endicott Johnson was again on the verge of bankruptcy. Free dental was ended, free medical and hospitalization required workers themselves to pay in, and a recreation center, 2 parks, and a golf course were closed or sold or leased. The number of employees dropped by 5,000 due to the crisis. Executives from a competing General Shoe Company of Nashville, the main competitor of EJ's, took over. The next year was marked by a succession of mergers, all designed to keep Endicott Johnson and its system of retail stores afloat. From 1971 to 1980, the McDonald Corporation oversaw the slow demise of the brand. By the 1990s, the factories fell silent in a state of disrepair, and the surrounding communities devolved into ghost towns racked by unemployment. The grandchildren of Endicott Johnson left town to find work and raise their families. They have been replaced by former New York City residents, encouraged by state welfare officials to relocate to a town with a more inexpensive cost of living upstate. There are boarded up storefronts, opiate addiction, and repeated attempts to revitalize the area without result. It took 2 decades for foreign competition from cheap labor in Brazil and other countries to end the experiment for good. No such experiments to improve the lot of shoe workers in the favelas and villages abroad lift the impoverished out of poverty the way that the beneficent capitalism of George F. Johnson raised thousands of families out of squalor. It's notable that no such experiments in the improvement of the lot of shoe workers has occurred in those places. The uniqueness of American capitalism as a force for good in North America must be translated to the labor forces that toil in poverty for pennies a day. The morality of the American people, largely led through the Christian churches and secular philosophies that reflected the teachings of Christ, drove forward that improvement of living and work conditions in the 20th century and should press for commensurate changes abroad in the 21st. Looking at the psychological impact of the deindustrialization of the EJ towns that followed the factory's demise, which is a rather inert term for the destruction of businesses and communities that followed the era of great trade agreements and offshoring, Maria O'Donovan called it, quote, the transformation of the valley of opportunity. It encompasses the initial sharp decline during deindustrialization and several decades of continued, often failed attempts at revitalization. This process has entailed significant social disruption, economic insecurity, and a loss of community. Accurately summing up the decline of Johnson's dream and post-war economic realities, she continued, quote, the hard reality of capitalist creative destruction and deindustrialization stemming from neoliberal policies have left little in their wake, except nostalgic longing for a more prosperous past. Thank you.